Today, we're going to unpack the incredibly complex chain of events that led up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And to really get it, to truly understand that moment, we have to look back, not just a few weeks or months, but really decades. Okay, let's dive right in. This timeline here, this is going to be our guide. You see, the 2022 invasion didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was more like the final explosive chapter of a story that's been building for a long time, starting with Ukraine's independence in 1991 and then getting a whole lot more intense with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So, how did we get from A to B? Well, here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the big picture, this fundamental clash of historical views. Then, we'll look at two major sources of tension, natural gas and NATO. After that, we'll zoom in on the final military buildup and the last few days before the invasion began. First things first, we have to understand the bedrock of this whole conflict. And it's a huge disagreement about history, about identity, and about Ukraine's very right to exist as a completely independent country. You know, just months before the invasion, in a really long essay, Russian President Vladimir Putin laid his cards on the table. This one sentence, it kind of says it all. It captures this core belief from the Kremlin, that the histories, the cultures, and the people of Russia and Ukraine are so deeply connected that any real separation is just unnatural, maybe even impossible. And this is where it gets really interesting, because what you're seeing here are two worldviews that just cannot coexist peacefully. On one side, you have this narrative of unity, of being one people and a claim to a sphere of influence. But on the other side, there's a fierce belief in national sovereignty, in the right to choose your own path. And that one people argument, to them, it sounds a lot like a reason to justify aggression. This fundamental clash, it's the background noise for everything that comes next. Okay, so you have these big, clashing ideas. But how did that actually play out in the real world? Well, beyond the history books, some very real friction points started to pop up. And one of the most consistent and powerful ones was natural gas. So after 1991, this really complicated energy relationship got started. Ukraine needed Russian gas, and they often got it at a discount. But this wasn't just a business deal. Ukraine's huge network of pipelines was also the main highway for Russian gas to get to its big customers in Europe. So yeah, both sides had a ton of leverage over the other. And this right here, this was the playbook. It played out over and over again, most famously in the gas crises of 2006 and 2009. It would start with a fight over debt or pricing. Then Russia would turn down the tap. And that didn't just put the squeeze on Ukraine. It sent shockwaves across Europe as their gas supplies started to dry up. It was a pretty powerful reminder of how energy could be used as a political weapon. Now, when you're dealing with that kind of economic pressure all the time, it's going to have an effect. For many in Ukraine, it pushed them to look west, to find more reliable partners and security. And that brings us to the biggest geopolitical friction point of all, the whole question of Ukraine's relationship with NATO. By late 2021, this is what it had all boiled down to. Russia basically handed the US and NATO a list of demands, or security guarantees. And as you can see, they were absolute. A legally binding promise that NATO would stop expanding eastward, especially to Ukraine. But NATO's response was just as firm. They pointed to their open door policy, which basically says any European country is free to ask to join. There was just no middle ground here. So, when the talking stops, what happens next? Well, with diplomacy totally deadlocked, the focus shifted from words to action. All through 2021 and into early 2022, a massive military buildup got underway. By the end of 2021, this was the number everyone was talking about, over 100,000. Western intelligence agencies were reporting this huge gathering of Russian troops, plus tanks, artillery, all the support, right near Ukraine's borders. They called it an unusual concentration of forces, way beyond any normal training exercise. So what did the West do? They started sending weapons, a steady stream of them. We're talking defensive stuff, like Javelin missiles, which are designed to take out tanks, and Stinger missiles for targeting aircraft. The whole idea was to make any potential invasion as costly as possible. But here's something that's absolutely crucial to remember. The pressure wasn't just about soldiers and tanks on the border. It was a hybrid campaign. Ukrainian government websites were getting hit with cyber attacks, intelligence reports were coming out alleging that Russia was planning to install a puppet government, and it even made lists of Ukrainian politicians and activists to be targeted if an occupation happened. And that brings us to the final, frantic sequence of events.
This is where everything just accelerates, where all that tension that had been building and building finally snaps in the last days of February 2022.
The first big red flag came on February 17th. In the Donbas region, where this low-level conflict had been simmering since 2014, the violence suddenly exploded. I mean, look at that. The number of daily artillery attacks went from maybe 2 to 5 on an average day to 60, and it just kept climbing from there.
Then, things started to get weird. Russia's security service claimed a Ukrainian shell had hit one of its border posts. There were stories of car bombs, of sabotage attempts. Ukraine and its allies immediately called foul, saying these were false flag operations, staged events designed to create a fake justification, an excuse for a military response. On February 21st, the political stage was set for good. In a televised address, President Putin officially recognized the independence of the 2 breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine, and he immediately ordered Russian troops to enter those areas on a peacekeeping mission. To pretty much the entire world, this looked like the invasion starting right then and there. So, with everything on a knife's edge, the world's diplomats made one last, desperate attempt to pull things back. They called an emergency session of the UN Security Council in New York, with ambassadors literally pleading for Russia to step back from the brink. And then, in this totally surreal, dramatic moment in history, while that UN meeting was still going on, a pre-recorded speech from President Putin started playing on Russian TV. He announced the start of a special military operation. Just minutes later, explosions were being heard in cities all across Ukraine. The invasion had begun.
Which leaves us with this final, really challenging question. When you trace this whole path, from clashing histories through years of economic and political tension to that final rapid spiral, you have to ask, was this whole thing inevitable? Was there a point of no return? It's a tough question, and one that people will be debating for a very, very long time.